Hello, Larry. Thank you so much for joining us with these interviews. Los Altos residents is so happy that you accepted our invitation to participate.
Oh, well, thank you very much for having me. I was looking forward to the conversation.
Great, wonderful. Well, let's get started.
Okay.
All right, I'll ask you the first of 5 questions. Why do you think you're qualified to be a city council member? And specifically, how do your qualifications make you competent to run the city of Los Altos?
Yeah, that's a good question, and one certainly that you have to think about before you even decide to run, that you'll be up to it. And because you're really making a promise to the voters that you'll do a good job for them, and you want to be sure you can keep that promise. So I've lived in the city for over 25 years now, and really have put down a lot of roots here in the city. One of the main ways I've been engaged in the community is through the Historical Commission and then the History Museum. And that's been a wonderful way to get to know the community, learn the stories of the community, both the people who live here now and the people who went before us. It's also been a place where we could make some progress. And a good example of that is all the work we've been doing in the orchard. I know that's, some controversy and people sometimes can disagree about which steps we take. But I think it would be very fair to say that it now looks better than it has in decades. And that's been through a collaboration of the work of volunteers, great volunteers on the History Museum side, but also a lot of good collaboration with City Council and city staff to figure out a method that would work and bring in professional arborists and so forth like that. And you and I have talked about this a lot as we figured out a good way to make sure that the library is doing a great job making a space for people to enjoy and look at the orchard, and also making sure the orchard is kept safe through the whole process, right? So I think that experience sort of showed me that if you sort of stay relentlessly constructive and spend time listening to people and understanding what they're trying to accomplish for the city, in good faith, you can end up in a good place. And I want to do more of that and serve on the council in that regard. I also have a good professional background. I was the CEO of several startup companies. Ended up selling those to various companies along the way, which gave me a lot of financial background, which is helpful. Although I do want to stress that this sort of notion of, oh, I'll take all my business practices and apply them to government is not 100% accurate. There are different goals, different need to listen to larger constituencies and so forth. But certainly I think familiarity with financial statements and so forth is something useful. It's also, my field was in mobile communications. And one of the things that I've heard from a number of people as I walk around town, just yesterday I was speaking to a gentleman who had decided to turn off his landline and now is completely dependent on his mobile phone for 911 calls and things like that. And so we need to be aware of it's not just a convenience, but can become a safety issue for people as well, something I want to concentrate on. And, I'm just sort of an infrastructure nerd. During the time of the pandemic, I signed up with Silicon Valley Water District and took I think 8-week course on how that all works and so forth. Didn't know that I was preparing for this exactly, but it's just sort of the things that interest me and help me get prepared should the voters decide that they want to have me on their city council.
Okay, thank you. So if you're elected, Larry, what do you realistically hope to accomplish or achieve in your first year? And then what do you hope to achieve in your 4-year term? Yeah,
and as you can imagine, what happens is you talk to people who think there's so many things that we want to do and so many things that we need to try to achieve. Where do we even begin? I'll say one that I'll just start with, which is such a foundational thing that sometimes you can forget about it, and that would be safe routes to school. And part of that just has to do with the time of year that I've been walking and meeting residents and so forth. It's back to school time. And so everybody, not everybody, but many of the people that I've met along the way are raising very practical issues of how do we make sure that the bike lanes are safe, how do we make sure that the traffic is flowing carefully, and so forth. Particularly, this is an issue down in the Foothill Homestead area, where in addition to the heavy traffic, there's also multi-jurisdictional issues between the city, the county, Sunnyvale, Cupertino, and so forth. And that's an area where I think constant pushing is really required of council. So that's an important area to me. One area that I think we need to revisit is our climate action and adaptation plan. That plan was built on the assumption that there'd be a lot of mandates. And there was a recent decision regarding Berkeley and the Restaurant Association there saying that such mandates aren't really allowable anymore. And so what that means is that if we want to make progress on that, and I certainly do, we have to think about more incentives and streamlining to make that progress. But I think that can be a promising thing, right? If you think about how many people put solar panels in, how many people have, gotten an electric vehicle. I think if you streamline things and put the right incentives in place, people will move in that direction, and perhaps more cheerfully than they would have if it was mandates. So in any case, those are the tools that we have, and I think we need to revisit that plan. We'll talk more, I think, later about downtown, but I think there's a real need for a very holistic plan about that. There's various piece parts that people are talking about, but I think, and that's probably more over the 4 years, thinking holistically about a plan to navigate all that, to accomplish everything we need and balance all the things there. One last thing I'll point out is that this may be the last election that we have, may well be the last election that we have with at-large candidates. And even though I live in the north of the city, I take that sort of challenge of being an at-large candidate very seriously. And I've spent a lot of my time walking and meeting residents more on the south side of town, because that's a little less familiar to me, and wanted to hear that point of view. And one of the things that I think we always need to be careful about on council is remembering that it's a long city. And while city council chambers are up on the north side, there's a lot of residents and a lot of infrastructure down more on the south side. Part of this is to the history again, right? It was 2 railroad stops, and both of them are part of the city. And so, one of the things that I would want to make sure is that we continue to be attentive to the needs in, say, Grant Park and other places along the way down that side.
Okay, thank you, Larry. So the third question is, what are you going to do to hold staff accountable for and to keep track of the multitude of projects in this city?
Yes, that's a very good question. Let me first start by saying that I think, I had the privilege of working with some of the staff members, from Gabe and Sean, various other staff members. And by and large, I find them to be very professional and trying to do good work in very constrained positions. And I think that is important to recognize, and particularly because honestly, we're competing for good staff, and we need to make sure that we treat them respectfully as the professionals they are. Nevertheless, part of the job is to hold them accountable and to continue to review things there. I'll say that one thing I think is particularly important here is being clear about the priorities. A lot of times when things kind of go sideways in one way or another, when you dig into it, the root cause is because council has either not been clear about priorities, or frankly, sort of ignored the need for priorities. There's that old thing where perhaps you're better about it than I am, but there's a temptation when you're packing for a trip. You think, oh, there's always room for one more thing in the luggage, one more thing, right? And you can fill it to the bursting point. And if you try to do that with the staff's time, you leave them to be sort of thrashing and reacting, as opposed to being clear about the priorities and being able to make decisions that way. That does mean, of course, that council has to explain to the public some things will not be happening, or at least won't be happening yet. A test of a real priority system is that it tells you what you're not going to do, not just what you're going to do. And so we'll have to be thoughtful about that. The last thing I'll say about this is I think that the budgeting process is very important, right? One of the key ways you determine what's important and what's not important is what you spend money on. And I think that this is a place, and I think this is a place where the city manager, Gabe England, has actually made good strides, but this is something I want to continue, is thinking about the budget from a zero-based point of view, right? Not falling into the trap of going, well, we're going to spend this money, or we're going to do this project because we always have, but rather each time you look at it with fresh eyes and say, is this still a priority? Is there a more efficient way of doing this? Are there some things that we can cut back on to be able to let other priorities come to the fore? That sort of thing.
Okay, tell me what you think about the state of our current community engagement. Is it adequate? And if not, how would you improve it?
Yeah, I mean, there's sort of a paradox here, isn't there? Right, which is that if things are going well, the residents aren't highly motivated to read every last detail of every last minute of every last meeting of every last commission, right? It's interesting how often when I, ring a doorbell and chat with a resident, say anything, any issues with the city, a lot of them just go, no, things are going pretty well, right? Mm-hmm. And so sort of an odd paradox is that the more that somebody feels like that, the less they'll be motivated, particularly because they're busy, right? They're having their careers, they're taking kids to soccer, they're, volunteering in some way or whatever. And there's a group of us who really nerd out and enjoy digging deep into everything going on in the city government. But that's not everybody. And that can lead to this thing when something does bubble up that may well have had a number of hearings about it, but people weren't paying attention. And then suddenly they realize it's going to affect them. And then there's a question then of why wasn't I informed, right? And I think this is a place where it becomes very important for council members to reach out to people, anticipate some of those things, and give people the chance to learn about it, interpret it, and understand what the impact would be, and really spend time outside of council hours, right? I would say that sometimes you try to too much in a council meeting, and it's really not a place where you can hear everything. People are limited to their 3 minutes, and it's very formalized communication. Sometimes the best thing to do is to get together with people. I've been enjoying this process. People have had the good manners to invite me to several like block parties and so forth, where I get to sit down with people, explain some of what I think is going on, but also hear impacts to them that I may not have anticipated and so forth. And so, one of the things that I think is important, and I certainly thought about this when I was deciding whether to run, was it's not just the commitment of the meetings, right? It's the commitment to make yourself generally available to people who say, hey, I want to have a coffee and understand this better. Or could you come over to meet with me and some of my neighbors about a parking situation we're concerned about or whatever. And really being able to offer all that time to the community as well as the formal meeting time is a key part of that. One last thing I'll say, though, that I think just really bears a lot of repeating and an emphasis is that's fine, all of that, but one that we really need to prioritize is the communication about emergency preparedness, right? We're fortunate that we have a good volunteer group, core volunteer group in our community who work on certs and the ham radio work and the block action teams and so forth. But I think that's an area, right? Because that's particularly an area where when people realize they need it,
Yeah.
earthquake has happened or whatever other thing, it's a little late then to react. I've actually, on all my campaign literature that I hand out, the front side is my politics, of course, my positions and priorities and things like that. But if you flip it over, what I did is I put all things about like the city emergency number, how to get the various alerts and so forth, and web pages to get like, there's a link there to a page about how to create a kit, an earthquake kit ahead of time and so forth. Because I think that's an area where, just the constant reminder, it's almost sort of the like wear your seatbelt part of public communications, right? Because you don't know when you're going to need it. So you just have to get in the habit of always doing it. And I think emergency preparedness is a key area for that communication.
Wonderful. I agree, being a cert.
Yeah. Didn't expect an argument.
Okay, the last question, Larry, and it's a current issue that people are concerned about. And how do you think the city can replace the 226 parking spaces in parking plazas 7 and 8 with no net loss of parking spaces, getting the approximate $20 million land value of those parking plazas, and third, the revenue generated by people who park in those parking spaces?
Sure.
3 things. Yes.
Yeah, and actually there's a whole lot of other questions well beyond that, for example, in terms of the proposed project in the other parking plaza to create underground parking with a park there, for example, which I think part of it could be part of it too. To me, I think that the thing to keep in mind is that this is a key time, right? Is that anticipating where this is going and anticipating what would happen is really key here, particularly because while the city still owns the land, is our time of strongest negotiating position, right? We're not required by law to topple over and give everything away. In particular, I think it needs to be a condition of the sale that the project replaces those 226 places, as well as anticipating the needs of the residents that are there. I also think that we could end up with a net gain in parking if we use park and lieu money to create a very capacious parking units over in 1 and 2. I have a personal experience with this, which is Sunnyvale. I used to work in that area, and like Murphy Street has some nice restaurants to be able to meet people for like business lunches and so forth. But when they had just surface parking, it was kind of a bother to go over there, and I just never did. They had a project called the Plaza del Sol, where they created a park with a lot of underground parking. And then it became my preferred place to meet people because I could tell them, just go to this parking place. There's always plenty of parking there. It's underground, so it'll stay cool. It's nice. And then meet lunch. So for me, at least, the experience in Sunnyvale was that when the project was done, it actually boosted my spend with Sunnyvale merchants,
Interesting.
so
Yeah.
forth. I'd also point out that the residents of these new buildings are also going to be spending money, right? So I think that it's easy to lose sight of the fact that in terms of vibrancy, in terms of spend and so forth, that you know, presumably some maybe younger families or whatever could really be adding something from all that. But this is the place where the sort of my inner engineer comes out, right? Because the thing that is true is that you can kind of have the vision of where you end up, but you can't snap your fingers and get there just like that, right? And so I think a key thing that I would be looking for in an overall plan there is, as you're in negotiating, making sure you're asking what demanding essentially what we need to have out of any development there, but then also thinking about how does the money flow the whole way through, right? So that you make sure that money is coming in at a rate sufficient to accomplish the task, and particularly how do you stage it to be as undisruptive as possible, right? What the thing that worries me the most when I contemplate these projects is that if all of the parking were diverted all at once, right, the blow that would have on the merchants and the employees, the people who work downtown and everything could be really, really bad. Could make the pandemic look like not that serious, right? And so I do think it's possible, more than possible. I can really imagine a very constructive outcome that everybody would be pleased with. But the key to whether they stay, they're pleased along the way, will be A, making sure that we don't run out of money in the middle, and B, make sure that we do it in a staged way so that the disruption is as little as possible as we respond to all that. So, but like, as I said, you know, my inner engineer is like, oh, this sounds like it's going to be a lot of 3-ring binders to study and
Yes.
and so forth. And oddly, that's the sort of thing I look forward to and enjoy.
Wonderful. Well, I'll give you an opportunity to just wrap it up and then
Yeah. Well, you know, first of all, thank you for the opportunity. I you know, thought these were really good questions and topical and so forth. And also for anybody who's tuning in who has done me the solid of spending 15-20 minutes with me on the porch. It has absolutely been my favorite part of this is when just yesterday somebody said, well, do you have a minute? And he pulled out 2 chairs and we sat in his lawn. We talked for half an hour about things that he was thinking about and so forth. And like, who knows how the election will turn out, but the treat and the privilege it's been to, you know, get to talk to people all over town about what they're thinking about and so forth. I just learned a whole lot. So I suppose what I'm saying is thank you to everybody who's taken the time to have those conversations with me.
wonderful. Well, we thank you for taking the time to answer all of our questions, and we will send this out to all of our subscribers and post it on our website. And, you know, we hope that by allowing our subscribers and hopefully a larger audience to have some insight into all the candidates, it will really help them inform their decision about who they're going to vote for on November 5th. And thank you for participating, Larry. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.
All right, take care.
Okay.